I want to welcome you to this lecture in the Maxwell School State of Democracy lecture series. This is the last lecture that we'll be holding in the series for this semester, the fall semester, but please stay tuned for our programs coming up in the spring. My name is Grant Reher. I'm the director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute, which coordinates these events. On behalf of Syracuse University, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands we now sit. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to issue some thanks. First to the Dean's Office for supporting the series. For technical support, I want to thank the Information and Computing Technology Group, and in particular, Tom Fazio. Thanks as always to Kelly Coleman and Sunju Raybeck. They work in the Campbell Public Affairs Institute, and they help to put together these events. I have a few reminders for you. First, if you haven't already done so, please silence your cell phones, your smartphones. Looks like some of you have not already done so. And second, when we get to the audience Q&A portion of the program this afternoon, I'd like to ask you to wait for me to recognize you. If you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand. Wait for me to recognize you, and then also wait for the microphones that will be going around to be passed to you. That's so that everybody can hear you and that you're part of our live stream. And also, as I've said before, please give the microphone back when you are done asking your question. Then third, following the talk, as we always do, we'll have a reception outside in the foyer where there will be refreshments so we can continue the conversation that we begin here. So now let me turn to the topic at hand and to our two speakers. It's been said that journalism is the first rough draft of history. And if that's the case, then when it comes to the 2016 presidential election, and in particular the Clinton campaign, Jon Allen and Amie Parnes have polished up that draft a bit and resubmitted it to us as a book. Their book's provocative title is Shattered: Inside Hillary Clinton's Doomed Campaign. Now, it obviously reads differently for different people, from political thriller to gruesome horror story. But regardless of that, there's a lot of material in there for us to reponder and reconsider now, looking back. And they'll be doing some of that with us here today, speaking about the book, but also pivoting off of the book to make some observations about what's happened since and to try to tease out some lessons and meanings. It's not the first time that they've trained their sustained attention on Hillary Clinton. They also published a best-selling biography of Clinton a few years before titled HRC: State Secrets and the Rebirth of Hillary Clinton. Jon Allen is a national political reporter for NBC News' digital unit. He's a former Washington bureau chief for Bloomberg and a former White House bureau chief for Politico. Amie Parnes is senior political correspondent for The Hill and a regular CNN political analyst. And between them, they have a wealth of prior reporting experience. I can tell you we had a smaller meeting with some of the undergraduate students earlier today, and Amie told a very moving story about her coverage of the events of 9/11 when she was in New York on the day. So our format for today will be that Amie and Jon will speak for a little bit, and then we'll move right on to the audience questions. So we won't have a faculty response. I think that makes more sense given that there's two of them here speaking today, and I know that a lot of you are going to want to ask questions. And then we'll return to the State of Democracy tradition with the reception that follows outside in the foyer, and again, we'll have refreshments there, but the book, Shattered, will also be available for purchase, and Amie and Jon are happy to sign that for you if you like. So Amie and Jon, welcome to the Maxwell School, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Grant. Thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you to Syracuse University and to, was it Onondaga Nation on whose chart we're on? Thank you also to the nation. I think what we're going to do is talk to you a little bit about what we were trying to accomplish with this book in terms of telling a story about the 2016 election, a little bit about what we think would be interesting for you that's inside of it, some of the conclusions, because there's been a lot of talk about what happened, and certainly Secretary Clinton just came out with her own book called What Happened. And also, I'm sorry, yeah, not question mark, just what happened. Punctuation's important. And then finally, is that better? Okay. And then finally, maybe talk a little bit about where we see the electoral battlefield heading into the midterms and into 2020. So I guess I'll start a little bit with what we were trying to accomplish with this book, the way that we thought about it, how it came together, and then I'll turn it over to Amie to talk a little bit about some of the conclusions that we reached and what we think really happened, no question mark. Because we talked to a lot of people heavily involved in the campaign, and our conclusions are based on our interviews with the people that worked on the campaign, outside of the campaign, in Democratic circles, in the Republican world, in the Trump world, and so we really feel like this is their story, and that's what we came at this book with as an idea. We first signed up to do it in early 2014. We started reporting in late 2014. We made a very early decision that we were going to allow everyone who spoke to us to speak to us anonymously, because we thought that we wouldn't get people to tell us what was going on in real time, honestly, if they felt like, or maybe even not in real time, maybe even after the fact, if they felt like somebody in power would be in a position to take retribution against them for what they said. So a lot of these people joined the Clinton campaign with the idea that they were going to be working for the next president of the United States. If they thought that they were going to say something to us that would come back later to bite them and cost them a job, they would be less likely to tell us the truth. We also believe they would be more likely to tell the truth if we promised them that nothing would come out before the campaign was over. If they felt like they could potentially negatively affect the outcome, they might not talk honestly to us. So those were two of the sort of big concessions we made as reporters, and we felt like that was the way we were going to get the real story, and the way to double check what people were telling us was to talk to as many as we possibly could. We talked to more than 100 sources for this book, many of them repeatedly, a lot of them at the upper levels of the Clinton campaign. The other thing we really wanted to do was tell a story about the campaign that took the reader into the room, behind the scenes, into the rooms where decisions were made, and explain how Secretary Clinton made decisions, and explain why she made the decisions she made, and allow people to see as much of the debate that went on between her and her advisors and among her advisors as possible. We wanted people to be able to live this campaign from chapter to chapter, from primary to primary, from debate to debate, as though it were happening right now. Even though people would know the outcome, we wanted them to be able to forget that while they were reading this and feel that sort of political thriller that Grant was talking about before, to live with the campaign as its ups and downs happened, the roller coaster of tremendous joy at big primary victories and unbelievable defeat actually through a lot of the campaign. I mean, one of the things that we were told was a mantra of the campaign staffers was, we're not allowed to have nice things, because they believed every time something good happened, there was another shoe that would drop. And it would be something that was very difficult to deal with, and something that could overwhelm the good news. And of course, one of the great examples of this is October 7th, 2016, which is the day on which the Access Hollywood video of Donald Trump leaked. There were three things that happened in quick succession on that day. One was the U.S. intelligence community came out with a determination that Russia had hacked the DNC, for lack of a, that's the short version of it. 17 U.S. intelligence agencies basically saying Russia was the culprit in the hacking of the DNC. Within a couple hours, the Access Hollywood video comes out, and then about 30 minutes after that, the first of John Podesta's emails are released by WikiLeaks. An incredibly momentous day. And if you're the Clinton campaign, you watch these two really positive things for your campaign happen, right? Donald Trump, I'm sorry, first the Russians have interfered in the election, and the case that the Clinton campaign was making at the time was that Donald Trump was encouraging the Russians to do that, if not completely in collusion with them. And the second thing is the Access Hollywood video where he brags about sexually assaulting women, whether or not it's true. And I mean, I've been in a lot of locker rooms. I've never heard anybody brag about sexually assaulting women. For men say a lot of terrible things in my life. Never has anyone boasted about it. This is a good thing. It was tremendous, like an incredible moment in our nation's culture and politics and history. And so both of those things the Clinton campaign looks at as good, and then boom, the third thing comes out, and it's going to be this month-long trickle of John Podesta's emails that get released and become an anchor on the campaign. And they sort of felt like that all along, that every time there was good news, there was bad news that came along with it. We wanted people to be able to take these rides. We wanted them to understand what it felt like to be working on this campaign. And of course, when we started, we didn't know that it was going to be so dark and ominous. And in fact, about a month before the election, we got on the phone with our editor, and he said, you guys have a problem. We had turned in a bunch of chapters that dealt with the primaries in the early part of the campaign. He said, you guys have a problem? And we were like, well, what's the problem? And he said, this book is so ominous and foreboding, and she's going to win. How are you going to reconcile these things? And there was just dead silence on our end of the phone, right? Because we didn't know how to reconcile that because we hadn't put it all together. We were going chapter by chapter, and we knew that there were all these sort of difficult things that they were trying to overcome, and in some cases they didn't, in other cases they didn't. And we didn't have that perspective that he did of having read all those chapters sort of front to back. And so he was really concerned that we had this dark book that sounded like she was going to lose and she was going to win. And finally, we came together with something like, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And then we scrambled to think about, like, how are we going to deal with this? Because there are some serious problems the way she's running her operation. And we sort of determined, well, that's going to be a significant piece of this book will be, how is this going to be, how do you spin this forward into what will plague her administration? What are the things she did well on the campaign trail that will help her, and what are the things that she did poorly that will plague her in an administration if in fact she wins? But we didn't end up having to go back and tear up stuff that we had written because we really had just been doing it sort of in real time, like I was saying. And then just one other thought on the idea of really taking people inside the room. After the election, we had this real devotion to one sort of guiding principle, which was we really want to tell people what happened on election night. We thought the question that's going to be hardest to answer, that people are going to least want to talk about because it's so painful, and in the wake of the election, so raw for the people that were working on Clinton's campaign, was we really want to get in there and give a TikTok. And if we aren't able to do that, we will have failed. That's something everybody's going to want to read. And by the way, if you buy the book and you skip to that chapter, we will not blame you because everyone does. And I think we were successful in getting you behind the scenes to see what it was like going from certainty of victory to, oh my God, we're losing, to, oh my God, Donald Trump is going to be president, to, oh my God, the Obama legacy is done, and walking through those moment to moment. And the only thing that we put out before the book came out, and it was after the election, so it kept with the promises that we made to not report before the election. We did put out one story that President Obama had called Secretary Clinton to urge her to concede as quickly as possible on election night before she was ready to do it. And we did that largely because we heard that somebody else was going to report it. And so we scrambled over Thanksgiving weekend. It went out under Amie's byline in her newspaper, The Hill, but we scrambled to make sure that we didn't lose that scoop. But I think that if you read that chapter, it's indicative of the work that we tried to do in all the other places, to take you into rooms where, where Bill Clinton is sitting screaming at the television in Iowa on caucus night because he can't stand the reporting that he's hearing about how this is just like Hillary Clinton losing Iowa in 2008, and he thinks it's much different than her losing Iowa in 2008, and by the way, she's probably going to win, and he can't stand what he's hearing from Wolf Blitzer and the others, and people out
Like he's sitting inside a hotel room in leather gloves.
If you couldn't hear that, he's sitting inside a hotel room screaming at the TV. He's got leather gloves on, which is like just so odd. It's cold in Iowa outside, so at some point he's going to be leaving the hotel room, but he's nowhere near actually leaving, and he's just sitting there with his leather gloves and screaming at the TV, and then screaming at John Podesta, and then firing questions at Hillary's Iowa director. I mean, the intensity and the passion is, I think, there throughout this book. So if you're interested in what happens on campaigns beyond the sort of broader question of why Hillary Clinton didn't win the election, I think we were successful in getting you really deeply behind that curtain. And I'm going to let Amie talk a little bit about some of the broader conclusions we reached.
So I know everyone here probably has an opinion on why she lost and how she lost. There's the Russia conclusion, which continues to dominate the headlines every single day. There's James Comey, the former FBI director, who we like to point out was definitely a factor, but he would not have been anywhere near the story had Hillary Clinton not used a private email server. And that point is sometimes lost upon people when you think about, well, he interfered over the summer, and then he came back less than 2 weeks before the election, and as Secretary Clinton likes to say, she believes that he is one of the reasons why she lost, if not one of the biggest reasons. I think our conclusions, we've concluded that when you win by 70,000 votes, any one factor obviously can make the ultimate decision and can sway the election. But I think there have been we concluded that there was largely a messaging problem that she had from the start, where she, from the very beginning of her campaign, is speaking on Roosevelt Island, and she's giving your standard Democratic stump speech. She's not really explaining why now. And this is something that we didn't even conclude. This is something that people internally told us. She brought on all these speechwriters and advisors to help her kind of cultivate her message. And conclusions that they reached were basically that she didn't have a reason for running. And we talked to someone at after the election who essentially said just that the source essentially said, I would have had a reason for running or I wouldn't have run. And this is a very senior advisor on her campaign. There are other factors. Bernie Sanders plays a major factor, and we can talk about how Bernie Sanders, the news of yesterday that came up about what Donna Brazile admitted, the former DNC director, about how the DNC essentially might have tipped the scales in favor of Hillary Clinton. But Bernie Sanders, at the same time that Donald Trump has risen, is essentially continuing to hammer home the message that you can't trust Hillary, that she is in the pockets of big banks. And then there's smaller things. There's a major likability factor. One of the most underreported stories, I think, of this entire campaign was the fact that millennial women, many of you who might be in this room, did not ultimately feel the need to support her. And I found this really fascinating as I was doing my own reporting, my own daily reporting, separate from the book, because I assumed as a woman that most young women would want to see a woman president. But ultimately, I think I was wrong. I think a lot of people came around ultimately and supported her, but there were I know a number of them who stayed home that day or voted for Donald Trump because they just didn't like her enough. And so I think that, and then there are self-inflicted wounds that she brought upon herself. Like as I mentioned earlier, did use a private email server, did use private email. She gave paid speeches to Goldman Sachs and never really saw a reason for, when people wanted an explanation, she couldn't really give one for why she was doing that. I think there were lots of factors, obviously, that played a role in this. What am I forgetting? There were many, many others.
I think there were a lot of factors that one could look at and point to as you were saying, as determinative when you're talking about 70,000 votes over 3 states. But I mean, our basic conclusion is what Amie is saying, which is Hillary Clinton didn't know why she was running for president. And if you read her own book, which just came out recently, it says that she ran for president because she thought she'd be good at it. Which is not a reason for other people necessarily to vote for. It isn't a reason about what she's going to do for them. Her slogan, I'm with her, is about her. And whether people like Donald Trump or not, his message was very clearly and cleanly about what he was going to be a tool for people to do, and that was to bring America back home from foreign entanglements, to cut down on trade deals, to build a wall between the U.S. and Mexico. Whatever you think of that, I think it was a pretty clean and clear agenda. I don't think anybody had any question about what it was he was promising to do, whether or not he has followed through on all those promises. You know, for her, one of the moments in the book that I think is most poignant is she's flying on a plane with Mignon Moore, who is a longtime friend and Democratic operative, and Clinton has just lost the New Hampshire primary, and not just lost it, she's gotten destroyed in it by 24 points or something like that, a state where she had won in 2008. And Moore is brought onto the campaign trail basically as a friend, as a confidant. Hillary's in a bad frame of mind, she's upset, she's a little bit confused, and so the campaign brings Moore out to sit with her and be her friend, basically, on the campaign trail. And she says to Moore, and I'm paraphrasing here because I haven't looked at the book in the print in many months, but she basically says to Moore, I understand, I can see that there's anger in the country, but I don't really understand it. I can't get my arms around what's going on in the country right now. And it seems so telling that that somebody who's running for president is acknowledging that she doesn't understand what the shift in the national sentiment is and what it means for what she should be doing with her campaign. That she's not able to take advantage of the changes in the way the American public is viewing its government and viewing its political parties and viewing its leaders and capitalizing on that. And we saw that throughout the entire campaign. We saw a candidate who truly believed in, throughout her entire life, in the ability to make change from within the system. We saw her in 2008 talk about Lyndon Johnson doing that as president, as a contrast against Martin Luther King being an activist outside the system, and it hurt her in 2008, but that's the way she thinks. The president of the United States is the one who gets to make the change because they're inside the system. And yet, a lot of people on the right and a lot of people on the left were saying, this isn't working. The people who get there to change the system from inside become insiders, and they don't change the system system changes them. And so her inability to grasp that, her ability to see the anger and not understand how to channel it, really contrasts with what Bernie Sanders was able to do in the Democratic primary and what Donald Trump was able to do on the Republican side. And interestingly, she still only lost by 70,000 votes over 3 states. And about a fifth of Donald Trump's voters said they didn't think he was fit to be president, which tells you that she failed to make the case for herself effectively. That there were people that were willing to vote against Donald Trump who went and pulled the lever for him. Is that kind of where you were headed?
And I think the larger point, too, is she should have crushed him. And that's what's missing in all of this, because people often tell us, well, she won the popular vote, granted, but she lost by 70,000 votes, and that's only 70,000 votes. And we often say, yeah, but this is Donald Trump, a man who was bragging about assaulting women. And in any other election, he would have been destroyed just on that. And she wasn't able to convince the people where it mattered in the electoral states that mattered that she was the right person. And there were plenty of people who supported President Obama who then went and supported Donald Trump. So I think that's a key moment. And also the fact that this was the year of the outsider, and you look what happened overseas, and you look at Brexit, and you look what happened in France, this was this was the mood of the world, really, not just domestically, but what people were craving. People didn't want the same old in Washington. They wanted to mix it up. So she wasn't really the right candidate for the moment. And I think that also hurt her, apart from a major liability in that, people often told me, these are Democrats who talk to us for the book and talk to me separately in reporting. You never know with the Clintons what shoe is going to drop. And I think people were always a little bit wary of, well, what else is coming? What else is hiding? What else is she hiding? Why are we even talking about emails? Why are all these, new developments happening every single day? And I think that ultimately, they were like little drops, but I think overall this whole thing contributed to a larger ocean and a bigger problem for Hillary Clinton. So.
I appreciate that you did not mix your metaphor there. The drops in the ocean, it's good. Stay with the water. I think maybe we'll talk a little bit about sort of where the parties stand. I also want to just, for what it's worth, we're talking a lot about why Hillary Clinton lost, and so that has this sort of, in and of itself, I see some unhappy faces out there, and it seems very heavy to people who were supportive of her. And I would just note that a couple of things from our experience. So outside of ourselves and our editor, the first person to read this book was the copy editor at the publishing house. And so we didn't know what people were going to think when they read it. And then the copy editor said to us, we asked, she'd read through it and done all the line editing and, very sort of intense micro stuff. And we were like, but what did you think of it? Because we're looking for some feedback, and she said it was cathartic. So if I see unhappy faces from Clinton supporters out there, just to let you know, the copy editor thought it was cathartic.
Also, we should add that there are Republicans that you and I have both spoken to over the last year, 6 months since the book has come out, and they've read the book, and they actually found themselves rooting for her. So in all this...
in places. Not overall, but they would kind of get lost in it and be like, oh, following along.
And I thought that was really interesting. So I think, and also I think just to, not to pat ourselves on the back, but I think this is a book that Spike Lee over to the left and Rush Limbaugh over to the right both liked and have raved about. So I think as journalists, we tried our best to not take a side. We're old school journalists who don't really root for one side or the other. We just tried to tell the story. And in telling the story, we're telling the story of not just the people who witnessed the campaign or who were volunteers on the campaign, but in the upper tiers of the campaign and what they went through, and this is their story. So I think we're proud of the fact that we tried to tell a really honest and compelling story, and that it appealed to both the right and the left.
And now for the crystal ball portion of the event. We're going to talk a little bit about where we think the two parties are right now, and what the sort of future holds for them, and a little bit about the Donna Brazile book that just came out, or the excerpt that just came out of the Donna Brazile book. I share an agent with Donna Brazile, so I hope she sells lots of books. Now, so.
And then we'll open it up to questions, because we could talk all day long.
I think one of the really interesting things over the course of the last, trying to do my math here, but basically over the course of the last 15 years or so has been the sort of dissolution of the two national political parties. I think the biggest factors in that were not intended, but the combination of the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law that changed the way that money came in to parties and limited soft money to parties, and the set of Supreme Court decisions that are sort of shorthanded as Citizens United, which allowed that soft money to go to outside groups in sort of unlimited fashion, and allowed them to come into play. And so what you've got is the parties are a lot weaker, have less ability to control who candidates are. And I know people will make the argument that the Democratic Party anointed Hillary Clinton and she didn't win any votes, and Bernie Sanders was destroyed because the Democratic National Committee was in Hillary Clinton's camp, and I would argue with that assertion. Obviously, Donald Trump came in and upended the Republican Party. He was not the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, or 15th choice of establishment Republicans to be the nominee of the Republican Party. He was the 16th or 17th choice, somewhere around Bobby Jindal. So what we saw was a really wealthy guy with a national profile who was able to come in and sort of hijack a party. And hijack is a loaded word, but I just mean he was able to take over the party and use its shell for sort of his own purpose. And you can do that now. And to some extent, Barack Obama was able to do that. He did a good job of straddling, right, the outsider-insider thing. He had enough of the insider people on his side to help, and frankly, the Democratic Party at that time was still standing as a structure a lot more solidly than it is right now. But we now live in an age where the parties really aren't able to control who the candidates are anymore, for better or worse, and probably some better and some worse. And I think that you'll see that trend continue along those lines in Senate races. We're seeing that with the Bannon primary challenges on the Senate to Senate Republicans. What you need is a connection of a very wealthy benefactor and activists who will follow, where that benefactor wants them to go. So somebody with a lot of money and a bunch of activists can really go outside the party system and, in fact, sometimes use the party against the candidates who have been elected to office. Basically, our country is not really happy with its governance right now. And there are different reasons for that. On the left, I think people want to see government take a bigger role. And they want to see a bigger distribution of wealth, a more even distribution of wealth. I think on the right, you see people want smaller government and more liberty from the government and a greater distribution of wealth, which is really interesting. We're watching this play out in the tax fight in Washington right now. The Republican leadership had to put out a tax bill that they felt looked like it was helping working class folks and not helping the very wealthy, even though there are provisions in it that help the very wealthy. When they talked about individual tax rates, they kept the top one at 39.6% because they didn't want to take a political hit inside their own party. That's anathema to Republican tax ideology, because what's happened is the Republican Party voters are more populist today than they used to be. And we saw that in the victory of Trump, and we've seen it with these Bannon primaries. So I think it's interesting to watch this sort of dissolution of the two political parties. And I don't know how long that lasts, and I don't know if at some point there's a swing back. Maybe Grant could talk about that more with probably a better sense of the history of parties and political processes and legislatures and things. But we are sort of entering this phase, or have entered this phase of transformation on both sides, and we're seeing it in both sides. Like, I would make the argument that there's no such thing as the Democratic Party right now. And there is no leader of the Democratic Party, and there's no center of gravity in the Democratic Party. And Democrats are sort of doing for themselves right now. They're looking out for themselves. You can see it in some of the CYA that happened after the last election. You can see it in some of the fundraising that goes on. Nobody's giving money to the Democratic National Committee at all. And part of that is that Tom Perez is a lackluster chairman. And part of it is nobody thinks that the Democratic National Committee deserves their money. And they would rather give it to individual candidates, or maybe give it to a Senate or House committee in hopes of getting some power at that level. I will turn over to Amie for a minute to talk a little bit about where she sees things going, particularly on the Democratic side, because that's what you're covering right now.
It is. And I think things are pretty dire right now. And it's hard to see because, as I was telling a group of students earlier, reporters in the country right now are focused on Donald Trump, and there's so much news happening on that side. But on my new beat, on the rebuilding of the Democratic Party, you're seeing that people are unhappy, as Jon said. They don't want to donate money. They feel lost. The party doesn't know if it's shifting left or staying center. A lot of people are trying to figure out what issues they can run on that will bring in more voters. But I think this is I'm curious to see how this all shakes out, because I think I agree with you in that There is no center of gravity right now in the Democratic Party. People have been trying to get President Obama, former President Obama, to come back in and play a role, and he's hesitant to do that because he wants new power, fresh blood to bubble up, and he feels like the more he's out there, the more his voice is out there, that A, he's going to be a foil to the Republican Party, which he doesn't want to be, and he's also preventing new leaders, and that's sort of what 2016 taught us, I think. One of the lessons is that the parties wanted someone new. They wanted someone to shake up the system. They didn't want the same old, same old. So I think, and this leads us into the Donna Brazile story, which broke yesterday. And there was a lot of consternation about that story because what it did was it gave the Bernie Sanders supporters ammunition, for lack of a better word, and to say this election was rigged and the party was never for us, and it supported Hillary Clinton. And what it's doing right now is it's dividing these factions of people even more so. As someone told me yesterday, it was like pouring, and this was a former Hillary aide said, this is like pouring buckets of salt on the wound right now because we're still trying to find out. We don't have an identity right now. We're still trying to rebuild. We're kind of licking our wounds from what happened still, and this is not helpful. And so I think that's what I'm curious to see. I think you're right in that people are, I talked to a few donors recently who don't want to come anywhere near the Democratic Party. They're supporting candidates, individual candidates, but not the larger party. They want to see what happens first. One source that Jon and I talked to recently called Tom Perez, the Democratic chair, an intern. And I think that's...
And that was a compliment compared to some of the other things people are saying.
It's true, but the Democratic Party story would be getting a lot more traction right now had it not been for the constant Russia headlines and Donald Trump and Paul Manafort, because it's a massive story happening right now. A lot of people ask us, as we've, after publishing this book, well, who's next? Who's coming up? And I think that remains to be seen. I think there could be a case for someone like Kamala Harris, who's trying to position herself as like the female Barack Obama. There are other people that could come up. We were talking earlier about mayors. Mitch Landrieu, the mayor of New Orleans, is a name that comes up as kind of a dark horse candidate, but he's a guy who's from a red state, who's doing new and exciting things, I think, in his state, and he's kind of getting a lot of attention. He addressed the Confederate statues issue even before it was an issue, and so I think what the party is wanting more and more is someone new and someone who can kind of go back to the roots of what it means to be a Democrat. And I don't know if you guys saw recently, but Al Franken had released a video which every Democrat has been talking about kind of behind the scenes lately, and it went viral, but it was basically what it means to be a Democrat and why he's a Democrat and how his, I believe it was his mother-in-law went to school on a Pell Grant, and conversations that really haven't been had in a long time, and how the party has lost its way. And I think right now you're seeing more and more of those conversations being had.
I was checking to see. I thought Claiborne Pell was a Republican, but I could be wrong. Anybody remember Claiborne Pell, Rhode Island? Sometimes Democrat and Republican are confusing in Rhode Island. Yeah, we should open it up. The one thing I was just going to add to what you said is when we see Donna Brazile's book come out and we see Hillary Clinton's book come out, we see these moments where they take over the spotlight. It's a great point that Amie makes, which is that that the Democratic inferno is not seen until somebody comes out and like sort of forces it into the news, and then delays the repair of the Democratic Party, right? So Trump takes all the attention. Democrats are still fighting amongst themselves at a low level. Then somebody thrusts them into the news just to see how badly they're doing from a new book or a new excerpt or something. And it doesn't allow them to get past the 2016 election. And we will see that continue, I think, for some time.
And we should also add that the Republican Party is also in shambles right now. I mean, that's obvious, but I mean, the actual party apparatus is not doing well. And I think all of that is being overshadowed by the leader of the Republican Party right now, who is Donald Trump. But I think if you look at both parties, they're both kind of in misery. They're both kind of fighting for who they are and fighting to find their identities. And I think I'm curious to see how that shakes out, and if Donald Trump has an opponent in the primary. You think he will? But anyway, we should open this up to questions.
Oh yeah, and if you right now, if you control 35% of the country, you win. This is what we've learned.
So I'm going to ask the first question, actually, and then we'll take questions from the audience. There's one that I want to make sure that you address, because the two of you emphasized the problem with Hillary Clinton's message and lack thereof as what you saw as one of the biggest things that was lacking and what you perceive. So this isn't your job, but just put the hat on for a second. What would have been the message? Give me the message that she should have put forward.
I'm not a very good political operative, which is the first thing a smart reporter would admit to. I may not be a smart reporter, but I've figured out how to at least approximate one. Look, I think basically she should have identified 2 or 3 issues that she felt were resonant with the country and used them to explain her philosophy and what she would do for the public. And she didn't do that. Amie likes to tell this story. There was like a wall in her Brooklyn office, and it had the words at the top of it, "Hillary is for," and then it had Post-it notes with all the things that Hillary was for, and there were like hundreds of Post-it notes. And a Democratic operative who saw that said, if you're for everything, you're not for anything. And I think it was very difficult for people to figure out what it was she was campaigning for other than herself. So it could have been almost any 2 or 3 issues, but I think she really needed to sort of condense and make it about what is it that I'm promising to deliver to the American public. And look, that stuff can change when you get into office. I mean, Barack Obama didn't start out the 2008 campaign thinking to himself, I'm going to be the guy that finally delivers, more affordable health care. That wasn't his motivating issue. But by the time he got to the general election, he had to communicate with Democrats, and certainly by the time he got into office, it was a huge priority for him because that was the priority of the party that nominated him and got him elected president.
Do you want to add anything? Okay. So I'll try to call on 2 people at a time. Here's one hand up here, and we'll get this gentleman here in the tie in the back. So we'll start here, and then we'll go up there.
I'm Nadira Azizova. It works. Sociology Department of Maxwell School. Thank you so much for your interesting presentation. As a person who is interested in women empowerment, I just want to ask one small question. No doubt Hillary Clinton is a very bright and strong woman on political arena in a global scale. And for me, it's very difficult to be a leader in your own family to consolidate all efforts and all members in your family. And of course, it's very hard to consolidate the majority of your country on a high level. So I'm just curious, what is your spiritual motivation and what is your support behind the scene that was visible during this debate campaign, very long election marathon, which requires a lot of personal, not only intellectual abilities, but also spiritual abilities and also a lot of support from others. What was your motivation? What was your inspiration, which we don't know? Do you touch upon this question in your book or not?
Our motivations personally?
Yeah.
Or personally? We don't have motivations. We don't.
Well, I don't know if that's exactly true. I think what she means.
Are you asking for the candidates' motivations or
Or
their motivations?
oh, Hillary
Yeah,
Clinton's.
okay.
She did a tremendous job, right, during this election campaign when she was walking through debate, from debate at the whole scale. What was her motivation? What did you see? Like, what motivates her to be a great leader, like a women leader, who could do this? Like you mentioned about the female solidarity.
Right.
But I didn't see the female solidarity in a big scale.
No.
So this is a question, and this is a big problem for female solidarity also.
At some level, like any other politician who seeks the presidency, Hillary Clinton was interested in power and in and you know, there's a certain amount of ego that goes with the idea that you would be the best president of the United States. And that's true of any candidate. I think the way that she justifies it to herself, I think the way she thinks about it, is that she has been blessed with, and she's a very deeply religious person who sometimes talks about it, but not a lot. Who believes that she's been blessed with a lot of talents and a lot of opportunities and a lot of platform, and believes that she should give back, that she has a responsibility of public service. It's very tied to her Methodist faith, and particularly John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, this idea that she, as she said during the campaign, to do as much good for as many people as you possibly can. I think that in her mind, that is her big motivation. I think that it is difficult to look at it from an outside perspective without also seeing a hunger for power in that. You know, that part of that is a justification for that natural hunger to be in charge. And as she said in her book, she believes she'd be the best person to have that power.
And I think you still see her kind of wrestle with that idea, because she talked about it recently, and in her book, she said, you know, I came to the debates more prepared. I prepared. And you saw that because she is at heart a student, and she's not a phony politician in the way that people just, you know, react and give you talking points. This is a woman who knows the minutia of policy, and we learned this in our first book. She will quiz her aides and make sure that they give her exactly what she needs to know. And if she's not satisfied and her thirst for knowledge is, you know, continues, she will ask for more, and she will always be the smartest person in the room. And I think that you see some of that. She felt like if she was the smartest person, if she was the most prepared person, that she would ultimately win. She would win the debates, she would win the election. And you still see her kind of coming to terms with that. Like, how could I lose to this guy? I came in, I was prepared, I prepared, you know, you saw that in the way they prepared for their debates. He didn't really prepare that much until the very end, until he saw that she was actually holing up in a hotel room for days on end and canceled campaign events and didn't do anything except stay there and, you know, practice for these moments. That wasn't what the American public, it wasn't good enough for some reason. It's not what the mood of the American, it's not what people were craving. But I think it's fascinating that she's still kind of grappling with that a bit. The fact that like she felt like she was the smartest person and that she could have done the best job. And I don't know if that answers your question at all, but I agree with Jon. I think that she feels like she's always pulled in, that people want her to run. She wants people to draft her into running, which is why she said she ran for Senate in New York. She said that again when we sat down with her for our first book. She essentially admitted to us that she wants people to feel like she wants to feel drafted. She wants to be part of a movement. And I think she feels like she is a public servant and she's there to do good and not anything else.
Gentleman up here, and then we'll get two more.
Excuse me. Thank you. So you guys identified a lot of these self-inflicted wounds that she did throughout the campaign, and then kind of talked about it afterwards. Did anyone, or I'm sure people on her campaign staff, had to have recognized it, and did they come forward, and was it listened to? And if not, was it because of just, like you said, because she had that aura of the smartest person in the room, or the culture, or people were there just like not to be retribution against, or do they think they're just going to win anyways? So what's the difference of changing things?
All of the above. No, I think that, first of all, I think unlike a lot of politicians who rise up to a high level, I don't believe that she thinks she's the smartest person in the room to the exclusion of other people having intelligent things to say. And I think that that's actually an admirable quality in a leader, that she does sometimes listen to other people she respects. However, the people who work for her are not necessarily those people. And so I think that there was a combination of people being afraid to raise problems with her and not having access to her. She stopped, as we report in the book, she stopped at one point, and actually for a long period on the campaign trail, having like one-on-one conversations with her campaign manager. And she basically demoted him internally without changing his title and raised up a bunch of other people and kind of put him on a committee of leaders that she would talk to, on the phone and stuff. But like, I think that there was a combination of people being afraid to tell her that she was doing something wrong in the event that she was going to win, which they all thought she was, and might seek retribution against her. Certainly within the campaign structure, there were people who felt like when they raised problems, Robbie Mook, the campaign manager, would seek retribution against them, would take away their staff or their title. So there was some fear. And I also think to some extent when people did get to her, they were not listened to, up to and including her husband, President Bill Clinton, who kept saying, you got to send me out to go try to persuade people on your behalf. And you've got to go out and try to persuade people, because one of the things we dive into in the book, and I don't want to get into it here because it can be boring and mind-boggling, but basically her team got very steeped in the use of data analytics to determine all kinds of decisions, where to send surrogates and which voters to try to touch, and which, all sorts of decisions were made based on these data analytics that were coming in. And she was pretty married to that, and her husband was like, you guys, like, the campaign is not making an effort to persuade people who don't agree with her that they should agree with her and vote for her. And the reason the campaign didn't do that is it's more expensive to get somebody who doesn't agree with you to agree with you and then get them out to vote than to find somebody who agrees with you and just get them out to vote. And so they were making decisions based on the idea that it was more efficient to do that, at least in part. And Bill Clinton was like, this is crazy. Like, we should go out and make our case. And like, he was used to doing that on the campaign trail, going out and talking to people who didn't agree with them and winning them over one by one. And even when he didn't win people over, he might soften their opposition, or it might be reported in the newspaper that he was in a town, and other people might read that and decide to vote. So he was saying, look, we got to be doing this in a more traditional political way of doing persuasion, and the campaign was saying no. And she wasn't listening to him. And so, she had a plan and she stuck with it and she lost.
We'll get this woman here in the yellow, and then anybody from the side of the room, like this gentleman right here in the middle of the seats. Will be the other one. Go ahead.
I think that the description that you've given to us is an extremely interesting one from the perspective of elections in the past. I have to say to you that it doesn't take into account the dynamics that were developed through the Russian intervention. And I want to speak to that particularly in relation to Hillary Clinton. Because what I think you have to see is that if, in fact, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, there must have been many people who voted for her as president, but who were voting down ticket for the Republicans in order to prevent her from being whatever it was being put into their mind she would be if she were president. And so what you need to look at is the subversion of the total American political system by the Russians in the last election, and no mechanism within the country to be able to defend against it. And I would say to you that Hillary Clinton's plans were clearly laid out and would have been very effective had there not been the undercurrent always, which was obviously a Republican way of doing things and the way they wanted to see her being undermined. But I would say that the Russian intervention we probably at the beginning didn't expect that they would actually not have Hillary Clinton as president, but were damned sure they wanted to make a situation where she could not be successful, worked very well. And unless you look at the election from the perspective of what is coming out now, you really cannot, we can spend a lot of time talking about what Hillary did or what she didn't do. But it really isn't that that's the crux of the issue in relation to the way the country thinks about her.
I think that, first of all, we knew before Election Day that the Russians were intervening in our election. 17 U.S. intelligence agencies came out with a report that said Russia was behind the DNC hacks. We saw President Trump, go out on the stump and encourage WikiLeaks to release information damaging to Hillary Clinton or anybody who could hack into her email to do it. So between those things, whether you get to the point of collusion or not, you could see that Russia was involved, and you could see that Donald Trump and Roger Stone and others were encouraging that kind of activity. And Hillary Clinton went on a debate stage and made the case to the American public. And she said, Donald Trump, you're a puppet of the Russian government. This was not a press aide from her campaign saying it. It was not somebody from an outside group making the allegation. It wasn't an anonymous background source in a newspaper trying to wreak havoc. This was the candidate for president of the Democratic Party standing on a stage accusing the Republican candidate of being a puppet of Russia. And the American public got to hear that case. They hadn't heard all the details that we've seen since then, but they got to hear that case, and they had a lot of evidence about it, and they voted for Trump anyway. Obviously, as we've said before, with 70,000 votes, you could point to anything and say that it's possible that it was determinative. I think the Russians are doing a lot to try to disrupt American society that is much larger than just the elections, but the elections certainly was a piece of it. It appears that they were making some sort of effort to infiltrate the Trump circle. I can't draw a conclusion because I'm not in the intelligence briefings. I haven't heard all of the evidence, but certainly there was it looks like an effort to recruit some of the people who were or claimed to be close to Donald Trump. The effort to manipulate the election does not necessarily equal success in manipulating the election. And when you talk, what we don't have evidence of is voting machines being changed. What we have evidence of is, or might at some point have evidence of, is propaganda reaching American voters. Whether that propaganda is done by the Russians or by somebody else, I don't know. It's hard to prove what is the thing that makes one voter vote in a certain way. I'm not sure we'll ever have a quantitative ability to analyze that. But what I do know is what Amie said before, which is Hillary Clinton should never have been in a position to lose to Donald Trump. It should never have been in a place where tens of thousands of votes in a few states. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, those are not states that should have been close. So we're learning more about the Russian intervention, but I think any voter that was paying attention knew that there was this effort. And the argument from the Clinton campaign was, and one of the reasons you shouldn't vote for Donald Trump is that the Russians are trying to elect him. And that was not successful.
And I would argue that they failed to make that case well, because as Jon said, we knew about it. 17 intelligence agencies had said that. They had ample opportunity in debates to make that case. But you might recall that after one debate, they focused on the woman who they called Miss Housekeeping instead
Alicia
of
Machado.
Alicia
Say her
Machado. But that was the campaign talking point in the following week post that debate, when Russia was already a known quantity. She could, and the campaign could have made a decision to actually, it was. We knew that they were trying to, of course. Yeah, we didn't know the extent of it, but we knew that they were involved, is my point. And that to me is a foreign government involved should be enough to get anyone's attention. And I think a lot of people internally actually see that opportunity as a missed opportunity, the fact that they focused on something else and not kind of hammering home the point that Russia was involved and that Russia was trying to sway the election.
And we hope you'll read the chapter Red October in the book.
We'll get this gentleman here.
First, I'd like to thank you guys for coming out and speaking at Syracuse. It was great. I don't think I'm alone in saying that the election night was quite a night, entertaining for some and not so much for others. But on that night, one image popped into my mind, and it's in a bunch of history books of then President or incumbent Truman holding up the newspaper saying, Dewey defeats Truman. Of course, I don't know if that was the New York Times, calling the election before they got the results.
Dispatch or something? Chicago.
Oh, Chicago. But it was that idea that so many of these places were already calling the election for Hillary, probably months before the election. And my question is, how were the polls so wrong? And do you guys touch on those polls and all those, how that affected the election? Do you guys talk about that in your book?
Well, we do talk about that a bit. Their internal polling was even wrong because if you'll recall, they were trying to expand the map. They weren't going, they had originally scheduled an event with President Obama in Wisconsin, for instance, and that event was scrapped because of the tragedy in Orlando. But she never went there because the campaign's internal polls were telling them, we're good here, we're good in Michigan, we're good in Pennsylvania. And they were trying to go to places like Utah and Arizona. In fact, she went to Arizona in the final days, which tells you where the campaign was. They never, ever thought that they were in trouble in these blue states. So I think we were following, obviously, network polls and their polling. And up until the final hours of the campaign, we were both talking to people who do polling for them. And they were saying, no, we're good. We feel good. They were feeling good. And it wasn't until the final, I was at the Javits Center that night in a filing room for reporters. And I was furiously sending, messages to people, trying to figure out what was going on. My editor was like, what's happening? Why do you have any sense of what the campaign is feeling right now? And we got an email from a very top official in the campaign who essentially said, we gave up on traditional polling in the final weeks of the campaign. They were relying, as Jon said, on this data, and they didn't see these certain places. They just, for whatever reason, they never saw it coming. And this is what the source told us, we never saw it coming. And so I think there's a lot to be learned in terms of polling and lessons learned there. But I think, there's something to be said also for people who weren't admitting that they were Trump supporters or Clinton supporters in this particular election, because I think they were both kind of contentious figures. But I think a lot of people will be studying what happened and how the networks got it so wrong and how the internal polling was so wrong in the years to come.
We also have in the book for the first time, the contents of a memo that one of Hillary Clinton's longtime advisors sent to the campaign in, I want to say it was April or May of 2016, during the tail end of the primaries, which basically said Donald Trump could win the presidency, and one of the things you ought to do is add 3 or 4 points to his side in any poll you see. That basically this advisor was saying the polling is undercounting Trump's strength all across. And this isn't a pollster, it's just somebody who was watching what was going on in the primary polls and somebody who had some friends in the Republican Party and just had a sense that there was, an undercount of Trump's support. But he said, add a few points to Trump, and he turned out to be right, but they didn't really listen to him. They sort of the campaign leadership treated people like that as though they were like kind of, you know, old school soothsayers or something, you know.
Even internal Republican polling was indicating in the final days that they were seeing actually an increase, an uptick.
They were seeing
support.
tightening in the Republican polls. They were doing a better, they could see the Midwest getting closer. And in some cases, they held back on telling reporters what they were seeing because they thought the reporters wouldn't believe them. Minnesota was going to be really close, and like if anybody had said that publicly, they would have been laughed at. But as it turned out, was it like 1 or 2 points in the end in Minnesota? You know, it was. I mean, that's not a state that Republicans should win, given, you know, the sort of basic makeup of the state.
Let's get 2 other folks. We got Danielle here, and we got someone else here. This gentleman in the back here.
Hi, thanks so much for coming to Syracuse. It's so great to have you here. So I want you to step back a little bit and talk for a minute about the legacy of Hillary Clinton and how you think your book fits into or conforms to or challenges the notion, the narrative around Hillary Clinton as a fighter. So if you remember in the first debate when they were asked to say like one nice thing about each other, Trump said, you know, when she gets beaten down, she gets back up and fights. And how do you look at, you know, the insights in your book as kind of consistent to what people have said about Clinton for many, many years, or challenging that, whether she will get up and fight again in the future, sort of the broader perspective about the legacy of Clinton?
We've always drawn that conclusion, I think, that she was a fighter. I mean, in our first book, HRC, we talk about that quite a bit, how here's a woman who has been beaten and beaten and beaten and then loses this brutal 2008 primary against a guy who came out of nowhere. And even then, people were thinking, how does she do it? How does she come back? How does she even get up the next day? She thought she was going to win. She was beaten by this neophyte, and then she has to go work for him. So what's that like? And I think on a human level, I think we can all relate to that in some. We've all fought battles, we've all lost battles, and I think we've, I think that a lot of people in the first book kind of related to the humanity of it. And I think that one of her biggest things will be that I think her legacy items is going to be that she is a fighter and that she does kind of, I wanted to call our first book The Phoenix, in fact, because I feel like every time she takes a massive fall, she rises even higher. And I think that is an admirable trait for her. I think post-election, what I'm hearing from a lot of Democrats is that they're frustrated with her, that she refuses to go to the sidelines, that she wants to constantly make the case for why she lost the election over and over again before even her book tour. And there's a sense of frustration there. A lot of people are telling me, well, why doesn't she take a cue from President Obama and just come up when she needs to come up and, you know, make her issues known when it matters. And so there's a sense of frustration now that not only has she done that repeatedly, but now she's on this book tour that is essentially hurting the Democratic Party because it is pulling the Democratic Party back to 2016 instead of letting it kind of rebuild. So I think there's some of that. I don't know how permanent that is or if that's just a kind of, I don't know, what people are feeling right now. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but.
Well, let me just start with, you know, I hope you don't mind me saying this. Amy's a single mom, and I'm a parent. I have 2 kids with my wife, and I always think to myself, like, how is it that Amie deals with like her job and the books, and her kid is sick, and she's the one that her child depends on, and life's like many crazy things coming at her. Like, how does she do all these things? And then you think about somebody who's on that level where they're doing that and they're getting knocked down publicly all the time. And with the exception of Twitter, I don't think people say vile things to you. But if you're Hillary Clinton, every time you walk out in public, somebody is screaming something vile at you. And if you see a pin or a T-shirt at a convention that's for the other party, it's something that's awful about you. And you just get beaten over and over and over again in that way, and you keep coming back. Like, to your point, like, I think not only does Donald Trump admire that, but when you talk to people about in the Clinton campaign, what did voters respond to about her? It was that she kept getting up off the mat. And so I think that's a part of her. I think that's a part of her legacy. But I think more broadly, what I would say about her legacy is that someday a woman will become president of the United States, and in her inaugural address, or maybe on the night she wins the election, certainly if it's a Democrat, she will talk about standing on the shoulders of Hillary Clinton, and she will be right that the nomination ceiling has been broken. Or shattered. And she will be right that Secretary Clinton walked the tightrope, tried to walk the tightrope that I think, I imagine, certainly every woman in this room who's been in the professional world for a long time has had to walk, to be tough enough but not too tough, to be just right in a boardroom or just right in their negotiations over their next job, and had to do that at this very sort of extremely public level. And so she's a trailblazer in a path-breaking generation of women. Wasn't the first generation of women to go to college or to be in the professional world, but certainly in terms of the size of her generation, she's basically at the beginning of the baby boom. So many professional women really changing society in a lot of ways, and changing the way that that our culture views families and that our culture views the empowerment of women in the gender roles. Like, being in that position was always a struggle for her. In 1992, she talked about not just sitting home and baking cookies, and got a tremendous backlash for that. She and her husband ran as two for the price of one, which was good in a Democratic primary, but created a backlash in a general election. I think that part of her legacy is that the next set of women who are running for president, and by the way, people are talking about Elizabeth Warren, they're talking about Amy Klobuchar, they're talking about Kamala Harris, they're talking about Kirsten Gillibrand. When was the last time you had 3 or 4 women named as potential presidential candidates in the next election? So when I look at what's the legacy of Hillary Clinton, I think the legacy of Hillary Clinton is, in a way, you know, not to get too biblical on you, but in a way to be the sort of the Moses character of women in politics, who can see the promised land of the presidency, but isn't able to get there herself. And someday, somebody help me with this, is it Aaron that takes over for Moses? Someday somebody else will be that Aaron figure. I'm bad at biblical analogy, but someday somebody else will get there, and she will have been a big part of that. And she will have been a big part of that as something that she has done on her own. She took those shots, and had she won the presidency, there would always be that question of how much was her husband responsible for her winning the presidency. I don't think anybody would say her husband is solely responsible for her losing the presidency. And certainly, you know, you can see that she took those shots that I think cleared a way for the next set.
This gentleman back here.
At the risk of being the guy asking the question about, or answering the question of women empowerment while I sit next to my co-author.
Okay, so you guys touched upon new blood in the Democratic Party. So my question for you guys is, do you think that new blood comes from within inside the party, or kind of like the Republicans did, like this outside source, whether it's Mark Zuckerberg or a political article I read, possibly Theo Epstein, the GM of the Cubs, possibly being option?
That would be a data analytics-driven campaign.
So I was just curious what you guys thought the next step was for this new blood coming up.
I think it could be all of the above. We were talking earlier about how the pendulum could swing back after Donald Trump, because he's this guy who came, who wasn't a politician, and how people might be thirsty for someone who is a little more Washington, who is a little more seasoned, who has those relationships, can make deals, unlike our deal maker president. But I think that a lot of people, it's hard to predict. And I think the biggest lesson I learned personally in 2016 was to stop making predictions, because no one would have seen, if you would have told me a year ago today that Donald Trump would be president, I would have thought you were the craziest person in the room. And here we are. So I've learned not to do that.
Probably got time for one more question here. We'll get this woman right here. Wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
You started to touch on it a couple questions ago. I mean, certainly her campaign made mistakes, and the Russians didn't help. But why is it so many other countries, Western countries, third world countries, have had women leaders? And I feel that a fair part of the explanation is the American people were not ready for a woman president, and I don't understand why.
I think that it was, first of all, she won the popular vote, so I think the country was kind of, I would say, make the case, was ready for a woman president, but I think they weren't ready for her. That plays on the ready for Hillary thing, but I don't think she was the right candidate. I think she had too many likability issues. I mean, you look at what Republicans are doing today. They're using her as a foil. This is a woman who is no longer in public office. And I just did a story this week about how they're launching inquiries into her still. They feel like she was hiding this uranium. There's this uranium deal that they're constantly talking about. I mean, I think she sadly had too much baggage and too many likability issues, and they tried to fix it. You know, there were so many moments during the campaign where her aides realized that they weren't appealing to people, and so they tried to roll out likable Hillary Clinton, and they even telegraphed that. There was a New York Times piece that said, after Labor Day weekend, here comes funny, lively Hillary Clinton, which
10% off.
Which I think ultimately was a problem. And when we talked to people internally about that, they called it an unforced error. They realized that she was struggling so much to win over people that they were trying to do all these new things, and they were trying to put her on Ellen DeGeneres countless times, and having Jimmy Fallon touch her hair, and tried to expose the fact, all these different things. And for whatever reason, it didn't work. But I think John's right. The fact that we are talking about other women is a positive sign to me that she was a trailblazer to help other people who might not have those particular issues finally shatter the glass ceiling.
I also think that when you talk to voters, and this is true of men and women, although in different measures, when you talk to voters, there are voters who would absolutely not vote for a woman, and there are voters who would almost vote for any woman, right? That there sees such a positive. And this tends to be more women than men, but not entirely true. And then there are a lot of people in between. There's a gray scale, right, of your willingness to vote for a female presidential candidate. And what I've found over time is, or what I've sort of concluded over time is, the job of the candidate, whether it's that issue or other issues, is to overcome the bias of people who think that whatever the characteristic is a handicap. So if you look at President Obama, 12% of the country is African American. He's an African American president. There are certainly some people who voted for him who didn't think to themselves when they woke up in the morning, I want to vote for a presidential candidate because he's black, right? So maybe some people did, but certainly a lot of people didn't. There are people who voted for him who also voted for Donald Trump. There are people who voted for him whom some people in this room would consider to be intolerant or racist. But what President Obama was able to do was, I think, get a lot of people who certainly didn't see his race as a huge positive attribute, a huge reason to vote for him for other reasons. And I think had Secretary Clinton been able to do that with people who were somewhat willing to vote for a female candidate but not necessarily excited about it, perhaps she would have done better.
John, you invoked my political science background at one point earlier. I'll channel it now and say the parliamentary system helps that question. But let me just thank the two of you for, first of all, your presentation and for your book, and for, in particular, I think, during the Q&A, putting on display the fairness and the even-handedness that you obviously had when you were writing the book. I really appreciate that. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.